She paid $150 for a building that hadn't had a working light bulb in 30 years. The county auctioneer laughed. The guy behind her in line laughed. Her daughter, when she found out, did not laugh. She cried. And yet, 18 months later, Maren Okafor would say that $150 was the most transformative money she had ever spent, not because of what she found inside the building, because of what the building made her find inside herself. To understand why a 53-year-old retired schoolteacher from Columbus, Ohio, drove 8 hours to a small-town Nevada county auction with no plan and a cashier's check she'd written to herself for the maximum she was willing to spend, $500. You have to know a little about the 2 years that preceded it. Maren had been married to a man named Douglas for 31 years. Douglas sold commercial real estate. He coached Little League long after their kids were old enough to find it embarrassing. He made the same 4 meals on rotation and refused to acknowledge this was a rotation. He died on a Tuesday in March from a cardiac event that lasted, the paramedics told her afterward, less than 4 minutes. He was 57. Maren was in the next room, grading quizzes for her 8th grade social studies class. The quizzes were about the geography of the American West. She has mentioned that detail in every interview she's given, as if the coincidence is still trying to tell her something. Grief, she said later, is not what the movies make it. It isn't a wave. It isn't a storm. For Maren, it was more like a sustained, low-frequency vibration she couldn't locate, present in everything, sourceable in nothing. She retired from teaching at the end of that school year. Her kids, twins, Jada and Kofi, both in their late 20s, called every Sunday and worried visibly during those calls, in a way she found both touching and exhausting. She joined a grief support group and lasted 3 sessions before deciding she wasn't ready to hear other people's versions of her own pain. She started and abandoned 4 hobbies: watercolor painting, sourdough baking, genealogy research, and amateur astronomy. The astronomy lasted the longest, 6 weeks, mostly because looking at something impossibly far away felt appropriate for where she was emotionally. The auction idea came from a podcast. Not a real estate podcast, not a self-help podcast, a true crime podcast of all things, that did an episode about a woman in Arizona who bought a condemned motel and discovered it had been the site of an unsolved disappearance in the 70s. Maren listened to it during a drive to the grocery store and sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes after she arrived, not moving. Something about the image stuck with her. A building no one wanted. A story no one had finished. She went home and spent 3 evenings researching county tax lien auctions in the western United States, places where, due to the particular economics of rural gaming history, small casinos had gone delinquent on their property taxes and been seized. She found a list. She narrowed it by driving distance. She picked one that felt, in her words, like it was calling to her, which she acknowledged was not a rational framework for a major financial decision. The Golden Spur Casino was located in a town called Delara, Nevada, population 812, according to a sign that Maren later photographed. Delara sat about 60 miles from the nearest city of any size, in a valley that felt like it had been arranged by someone with a dramatic sense of landscape. Red cliffs on 3 sides, a dry riverbed cutting through the center, and a main street exactly 7 blocks long. The Golden Spur had been the town's only gambling establishment. It opened in 1967, changed hands twice, and closed definitively in 1994, following what local records described vaguely as a dispute between the ownership and the county gaming board. Maren found this description in a county records database at 2 in the morning and wrote the phrase "dispute with the county gaming board" on a notepad in red ink, underlined it twice, and went to bed. The day of the auction, she drove through the night to get there. The auction was held in the parking lot of the Delara Town Hall, which was also the post office and, based on the signage, doubled as a notary. 11 properties went up that morning. 9 of them went to 2 developers from Las Vegas who sat together in folding chairs, and barely lifted their paddles above their knees. One went to a local rancher who seemed to have been expecting to win it. And then there was the Golden Spur. The auctioneer, a compact man named Gene who wore a bolo tie and clearly did not want to be standing in front of this particular property, described it as a commercial structure in need of significant remediation with unresolved title history. The opening bid was $50. Maren bid $150. Nobody else bid. She thought she had made a catastrophic mistake. She was probably right. The deed transfer took 20 minutes. She signed papers at a folding table while Gene packed up his equipment, and the Las Vegas developers drove away in a white SUV. A woman from the county recorder's office handed Maren a manila envelope with copies of the title documents, the tax lien history, and a note that said, in printed type, that the property had been the subject of an unresolved administrative hold from 1994 to 2003, before reverting to standard delinquent tax status. Maren asked the woman what an administrative hold was. The woman said she didn't know. She asked Gene before he left. Gene said he didn't know either, but that he'd seen a few of them over the years, and they were usually nothing interesting. He paused after saying this, in a way that suggested he did not fully believe it. She went inside for the first time that afternoon. The key had been included in the envelope, a standard commercial deadbolt key, not particularly old-looking, which she found strange given the building had been locked for 30 years. The front door opened with less resistance than she expected. She stepped in. The carpet, which had once been deep red, had faded to the color of dried rust in the places where the roof had leaked, and gone nearly black in the corners where it hadn't. The slot machines stood in rows along the north wall, their faces blank and dusty. Behind the main floor, a bar ran the full width of the building, stools still in place, glasses still on the shelves behind it, every glass facing the same direction, rims down, the way a careful bartender closes up at the end of a shift. Someone had closed this place expecting to come back. That was the first thing that felt wrong. She didn't touch anything that first day. She photographed everything methodically, moving through the space in a grid pattern the way she'd once taught her students to approach unfamiliar primary source documents. Observe before you interpret. There were 3 rooms off the main floor. A storage room packed with cardboard boxes she didn't open. An office with a desk, a filing cabinet, and a calendar on the wall still open to October 1994. And a third room, smaller, that she couldn't immediately identify. No windows. Carpeted walls the way you'd soundproof something. A table in the center with 4 chairs around it. The room had a lock on the inside of the door as well as the outside. She stood in the doorway of that room for a long time. She drove to the one motel in Dallara. 8 rooms, run by a man named Artie, who seemed unsurprised to see a stranger in town, but surprised that the stranger wanted a room for more than one night. Over breakfast the next morning at the diner, 2 doors down, she mentioned that she'd bought the Golden Spur. The reaction was immediate and specific. The waitress stopped refilling her coffee mid-pour. The 2 men at the counter exchanged a look. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then the waitress said, "Oh, that old place," and refilled the coffee and didn't bring the check for another 45 minutes. Maren sat with her eggs and took note of every single thing about that pause. She spent the next 3 days in the Dallara Public Library, which shared a building with a laundromat in a configuration that seemed to have made sense to someone at some point. The library had one room dedicated to local history, which the librarian, a retired schoolteacher herself, which Maren considered a good omen, described as more of a storage situation than a collection. In boxes and binders and one accordion folder, held together with 2 rubber bands and a prayer, Maren found the local newspaper archives going back to 1952. The Golden Spur appeared in those archives 214 times, which she counted. The last mention was a brief item from November 1994, 3 weeks after the calendar in the office had stopped. It said only that the Golden Spur Casino had voluntarily suspended operations pending review. It named no person. It explained nothing. What Marin found in the earlier archives was more interesting. Throughout the 70s and into the 80s, the Golden Spur had been covered regularly, and not just for the usual small-town reasons. It had hosted a series of poker tournaments that drew players from across the region. It had a restaurant attached, since demolished. It had been the site of a 1979 fundraiser for a local family whose house had burned, and another in 1983 for a rancher who'd lost his herd to disease. The casino's second owner, a man named Walt Garrity, appeared in the paper frequently, cutting ribbons, sponsoring the school baseball team, donating to the library's book drive. He sounded, from the clippings, like the kind of person a small town builds itself around. And then his name stopped appearing entirely in 1991, 3 years before the casino closed. The librarian, whose name was Patricia, and who had lived in Dallara for 60 of her 72 years, confirmed that Walt Garrity had existed, and that his disappearance from public life had been noticed. She chose the word noticed deliberately, Marin felt. Patricia said Walt had sold the casino in 1991 to a holding company whose name she couldn't remember, moved out of the house he'd lived in for 20 years, and was believed by most people to have simply relocated. No scandal that anyone could point to publicly. No legal proceedings that made the papers. He was there, and then he wasn't, and Dallara had continued in the way small towns do, absorbing the absence and not talking about it much. Patricia said this last part while straightening a perfectly straight stack of papers on her desk, which Marin also noted. She called Jada that evening from the motel parking lot. Jada was a social worker in Atlanta and had her mother's habit of listening carefully before responding. Marin explained what she'd found so far. Jada was quiet for a moment and then said, "Mom, are you actually investigating something?" Marin said she wasn't sure what she was doing. Jada said that sounded like a yes. Marin said maybe. Jada said she was going to tell Kofi, and Marin said please don't, and Jada said I already did, and he says to be careful. That was the call. It lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, Marin sat on the hood of her car and looked at the red cliffs and thought that she felt, for the first time in over a year, like she was in the right place. Over the following 2 weeks, she began talking to people. Not formally, not with a recorder or a list of questions. She bought coffee for people. She ate dinner at the diner every evening. She went to a Sunday service at the Lutheran church because Patricia mentioned that some of the older congregants had known Walt Garrity personally. She was transparent about who she was and what she'd bought, and she found that the transparency opened more doors than deflection would have. People in Dallara had complicated feelings about the Golden Spur. Some remembered it fondly, the tournaments, the restaurant, the way it had anchored the commercial life of the main street. Others were more guarded. A few were actively reluctant, with a reluctance that had texture to it, the kind that suggests old loyalty rather than indifference. The first person who told her anything substantive was a man named Ray DeLuke, 78 years old, who had worked as a slot machine technician at the Golden Spur from 1979 to 1991, the full span of Walt Garrity's ownership. Ray had not initially been forthcoming. He'd been one of the guarded ones, but 2 weeks in, he found Marin at the diner on a Wednesday morning and sat down across from her, without asking, and ordered coffee, and said, "I figured you'd find it eventually anyway, so I'd rather you hear it from someone who was there." She said, "Hear what?" He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and said, what Walt was actually doing with that building for the last 4 years. He owned it. The room with the carpeted walls and the table and 4 chairs. The room Marin had stood in the doorway of on that first day had not been a card room or a private dining space or any of the things she'd tentatively guessed. It had been, Ray told her, the weekly meeting place for something Walt had organized starting around 1987. Walt called it a community fund, which was deliberately vague. What it actually was, in practice, was an informal an entirely unlicensed mutual aid arrangement. People in Dallara and the surrounding area who hit genuine hardship, medical debt, failed crops, fire damage, the particular disasters of rural poverty, could make a case to a small group of 5 or 6 people, of which Walt was one, and receive money from a pooled fund that Walt maintained. No interest, no repayment required if repayment was impossible. No formal application. You showed up and told the truth, and the group decided. Ray said the fund had helped somewhere between 40 and 60 families over its 4-year operation. He wasn't certain of the exact number, because the records had been kept deliberately incomplete, not to hide wrongdoing, but to protect the recipient's privacy. Walt had been firm about that. Nobody who received money would ever be named or listed anywhere. The group met in the carpeted room because it had no windows, and the inside lock was so that nobody could walk in accidentally during a meeting. The structure was informal, specifically so it couldn't be regulated or taxed or shut down as an unlicensed financial institution, which is exactly what it would have been called if the state had ever noticed it. And eventually, Ray said, someone did notice. In 1991, Walt received a visit from representatives of the Nevada Gaming Control Board, not about the casino's gambling operations, which were entirely legal and in good standing, but about the fund. Someone had reported it. Ray didn't know who, and Walt had never said, and Marin would later spend considerable time trying to determine this and ultimately fail. The regulators told Walt the fund constituted unlicensed lending activity and was subject to immediate audit and potential criminal referral. Walt disputed this characterization. The fund didn't charge interest. It wasn't a loan operation. But the process of a regulatory dispute is long and expensive and visible. So Walt made a calculation. He dissolved the fund. He sold the casino to protect its staff and its gaming license from being entangled in the dispute. He moved away so that the investigation would follow him personally rather than affect Dallara. And he never told most of the people involved exactly why. Marin sat across from Ray in that diner for 2 hours. She asked him where Walt had gone. Ray said he'd heard Oregon, then later Arizona. Walt had written to him once, in 1993, a short letter that said only that the matter had been resolved without charges, and that he was well, and that he hoped Dallara was too. Ray had kept the letter. He pulled it from his jacket pocket. He'd brought it specifically, she realized, and slid it across the table. She looked at it without touching it for a moment. The handwriting was large and careful, the kind you develop when you've learned to write slowly so other people can read it. She thought about the bartender who had faced all the glasses the same direction before closing up. She thought about a man who organized protection for other people's privacy as meticulously as he'd organized everything else. Then, she thought about the filing cabinet in the office she still hadn't opened, because she'd been saving it without knowing why. The filing cabinet was locked with a standard office lock, and the key for it was not in the envelope she'd received at the auction. She had a locksmith come from the nearest city, a 2-hour drive each way, because there was no locksmith in Dallara. While she waited, she sat in the office in the desk chair and looked at the October 1994 calendar. The X's through the days stopped on the 23rd. Whatever had happened on the 24th, or someone had simply stopped marking days sometime during the 23rd. She had been teaching 8th graders about the American West on a Tuesday in March. Walt Garrity had stopped marking his calendar on a Thursday in October. She found, unexpectedly, that she understood the feeling of a stopped calendar very well. The filing cabinet contained 4 drawers. The top 2 were standard casino records, gaming receipts, employee tax documents, maintenance logs, vendor invoices, none of it interesting. The 3rd drawer held the casino's entertainment booking records, which were a brief and somewhat melancholy history of regional country acts, and one magician who had performed 3 Friday nights in a row in 1983. The bottom drawer was almost empty. It held 1 folder. Inside the folder were 2 things: a handwritten list of names and amounts, 47 entries in the same large, careful handwriting, as the letter Ray had shown her, and a sealed envelope with no addressee. The list was the fund's records, the ones that weren't supposed to exist, that Walt had apparently kept anyway, in a locked drawer, for reasons he would have been able to explain and no one else could. She did not open the sealed envelope immediately. She photographed the list, locked the cabinet again with the locksmith's spare key, and drove back to the motel. She called Jada. She described what she'd found. Jada said, "Mom, you have to open the envelope." Maren said she knew that. She said she was going to. She said she just needed a minute. Jada, who knew her mother, said, "Take your time," and stayed on the line. Maren sat on the edge of the motel bed and held the envelope and looked at nothing in particular for 4 minutes, which Jada timed silently on her end. Then Maren opened it. Inside the envelope was a letter. It was addressed to no one. It began with the words, "If you're reading this, I either trusted you or I didn't get to decide." Walt had written it, by the date at the top, in September 1994, a month before the calendar stopped. In the letter, he explained that he was keeping the list against his own rules because he wanted someone, eventually, to know that those 47 families had been helped, and that the help had been real, and that it had mattered. He didn't expect the letter to be found soon. He wrote that he'd made peace with the casino closing, and with leaving. He wrote one other thing, near the end of the letter, that Maren has repeated in every interview since. He wrote that he'd learned, over those 4 years, that the hardest thing to give people isn't money. It's the experience of being believed. Most of the people who came to that room, he wrote, had spent years being told their problems were their own fault. Sitting across from 5 people who simply believed them, that was the part that seemed to matter most. Maren sat with that letter for a long time. Then she did something that I think surprises people when they hear it. She didn't make a dramatic announcement. She didn't hold a town meeting. She didn't track down all 47 names on the list and make a news event out of revealing them. She hired a local contractor and began the slow, expensive, partially subsidized process of rehabilitating the building. Not as a casino, which would have required licensing she had neither the money nor the inclination to pursue, but as a community space, a hall. The kind of place that can hold a county commissioner's meeting and a birthday party for an 80-year-old and a class for adults learning to read, sometimes in the same week. She moved to Dallara. She rented Artie's motel room for 6 months while she worked on a small house on the edge of town. Ray DeLuke helped her find contractors who would give her fair prices. Patricia from the library helped her apply for a historic preservation grant that covered about 1/3 of the renovation cost. The carpeted room she left exactly as it was. She put a new table in it and better chairs and kept the inside lock on the door. She uses it for conversations that need privacy. She said in one interview that she thinks of it as inherited infrastructure. She means that seriously. The 47 names on Walt's list stayed private. She made that decision firmly and early, and did not waver. What she did do was find Walt. He was alive, in his 80s, in a small town in Arizona, and write him a letter telling him what she'd found and what she'd done with the building. He wrote back 4 months later. She has not shared what he said. She says that letter belongs to both of them, and that some things aren't for broadcasting. 3 years after the auction, the Golden Spur, its sign still missing one R because Maren decided to leave it that way, is a functioning community hall with a waiting list for its event space and a Thursday morning gathering that started as coffee for anyone who wanted company and has become, without anyone planning it, one of the most attended weekly events in a county that doesn't have many. She still teaches, informally, when people ask her to. She still calls Jada and Kofi every Sunday. She still has the deed framed in the front hallway of her house, next to a photograph she took of the interior on that first day. The dust, the blank slot machines, the glasses behind the bar, all facing the same direction. She says the photograph is there to remind her that closed doesn't mean finished. That someone's unfinished care for other people can sit in a locked room for 30 years and still be warm when you find it. If this story stayed with you, there are more like it. People making strange, quiet, consequential decisions in places nobody was watching. They tend to be the ones worth finding.